What's up, everyone? Beast Mode back here with another video. So today we are going to discuss why Vayu just seems to win every event. Of course, I am open to your opinions in the comments, so please share your thoughts regarding the deck and or the landscape of the format right now. So I don't know if you've all watched, and if you haven't, you should watch the Crow's Nest channel. Snack has compiled a Excel spreadsheet for all of 2023. She's really into the analytics and does a great job with all that on her channel, the Crow's Nest channel. I believe she made a video yesterday just kind of reviewing 2023, the decks that topped and the players who have won and whatnot. And as you can see here, it's pretty crazy how Vayu has 27 tops and 9 wins. So that's a substantial amount of tops and even higher amount of wins. It's won the most events in 2023. And I believe this includes probably 90% of the tournaments. I know Fullerton wasn't included, and I think Hero Frog won that. But regardless, Vayu and Blackwing, they top just about every event. You can see here, Blackwing has 45 tops. So this deck tops the most. It's also the most represented in most events, but only has 6 wins. And another thing that's pretty crazy, and I'm not quite sure why, but Hero has 40 tops, but not a single win. And if I remember correctly, she included Diva Hero, Hero Beat, Diva Hero Beat, all the hero decks essentially, and not a single one has won a tournament in 2023, which is crazy because it has 40 tops. It's the second most prevalent deck in Top Cut, but yet just can't win an event. And I'm not entirely sure why. I haven't really sat back and tried to figure that out. Maybe someone else has. I'd be interested to hear why. But today we're going to talk about Vayu. Why does this deck win? Why does it convert so high? Once it hits Top Cut, it just converts into wins. And I've kind of been thinking about it. I think the reason why is because the deck does not have a single weakness. I can't find any weaknesses off the top of my head. I might be missing a glaring one, but just oversight. But I don't see any, and I can't think of any. And I've looked at the deck. I've played the deck mainly for content. I've never played it in tournament play, and I was extremely impressed with the deck. And I've said that many times in videos. I think the deck is extremely consistent. Number one, it doesn't have very many bad hands at all because even all monster hands in this deck, you draw Greffer, Sirocco, Vayu, you can just OTK with them. All monster hands sometimes are the best hands in this deck, just because, especially if you have Dark Arm. It's the best Dark Arm deck of the format. It's live almost all the time. It's initially, probably about a year ago when I first started the channel, I believe Quick Draw was the best Raikou hamster deck. I have since changed my mind on that. That's no doubt that this is the best Raikou hamster Caius deck of the format. This Raikou is probably one of the strongest cards in this deck, aside from the power cards like Burial, Return, Dark Arm. The reason why is going first with this deck specifically creates so much problems for your opponent. It really is a dilemma turn one because you don't know what your opponent set turn one. Is it a hamster? Is it a Raikou? Is it a Vayu? That creates you this situation where you don't know if you should be attacking the face down monster, or if you set a face down monster and they flip a hamster and then they tribute for Caius. It just creates a lot of scenarios for the opponent, and it's hard to get an accurate read of what's going on here. Plus, Raikou not only destroys a card on the field, but it just fuels the deck, and it just mills constant. Milling any one of these 6 cards is great. Milling Necrogarner is great. Plague is great. So this is very, very strong in the deck. Also, this deck just picks apart back row, so typical cards that would be decent against Vayu Turbo, like D-Prisons, Bottomless, they just get eaten up with the Raikou. So this card right here is really a problem in this deck, and we've said this before. The Hamster Raikou Caius is like the strongest sequence of cards aside from power cards in the game, in the format anyway. So I think that this card here really is one of the key cards of the deck and creates a lot of problems. But going back to the fact that I don't think the deck has any real weakness is because it doesn't. What do you side deck against Vayu when you play against it? Nobleman, maybe? You might be able to put in a Nobleman, and you're hoping that you're going to hit a Raikou or a Hamster with Nobleman, and oftentimes your opponent could just play, maybe you go first, you're setting a card, and then you have a Nobleman in your hand, you're hoping your opponent sets something, and maybe they just summon Greffer and pitch a Vayu and Sirocco to the graveyard, and they don't actually set anything, because the deck can play very aggressive that way as well. You just don't know how they're going to open. So Nobleman, you can say, is a decent card for it, but aside from that, what else are you going to sideboard in? Compulse? Compulse is pretty strong, but you also have to have the Compulse at a time where they have the Armed Wing or Armor Master. But aside from that, when you're side decking cards that just do 1-for-1, like I always say Dust Tornado. You side that in against Blackwings. Like, this card is not game breaking at all, and that's the best thing you have against the deck. These are the reason why these decks top so often, because they just don't. They're so resilient. They don't have any real weaknesses. So let's look at some of the other decks and figure out why when we get into the top cut. Now, these decks are the ones that top a lot of the events. If we look at the numbers here, I have a hero deck up, I have a Blackwing deck, all these decks that you see majority of the numbers, especially Dragon, we're going to kind of look at and see some of the reasons, and maybe we can formulate the reasons why Vayu just wins these tournaments. So against Dragon Turbo, so this deck is really gaining some momentum at this point. It's not my cup of tea. A lot of people don't like it, but it's obviously moving into the S tier category. It's just that if this deck became prevalent in the format, it wouldn't be very fun for anybody, really. I do suspect in 2024 we're going to see more of this. I will be making a tier list video, and we can really get into what decks I think are going to start rotating in and out. But playing against Vayu, and we actually got to witness that at Rulers in the finals, that this deck here does not often go off turn one and make that unbreakable board. It usually takes a turn or two. And in the meantime, if you're playing against Vayu, because we know how aggressive the deck can be, you can drop 4,000 turn one. So this deck can actually just outpace Dragon Turbo. Sometimes if this deck does not draw the Future Fusion and just draw the bananas turn one, Vayu is able to just put enough pressure on the board where they just win. So I think that, and Blackwings also gives this deck a bit of a problem because of how aggressive you can play. Now, of course, if you just have the bananas hand, this deck can't lose, but that doesn't happen all the time. And, you see some of the better players, Hydro Pump, Ghost Rider, some of those players that play Dragon Turbo, and they really are able to grind out those games where the hands are not that strong. It's harder to do against decks like Vayu because of how aggressive it can be. Also, this deck plays Royal Oppression in the side, so that's another card that can hurt the Dragon deck. Of course, they usually wait for the Heavy and or Trunade. Vanity's Fiend is another strong card against the Dragon deck. So this deck is able to play all of that, okay, and or side it. So that's one of the reasons why when you see Vayu versus Dragon Turbo, I feel like Vayu is favored, just because of the fact that they have cards that inherently just stop this deck. And now no deck is ever going to beat Dragon Turbo when they draw bananas. It's just that's just how the deck is. It doesn't matter. But I'm referring to the games where they just don't outright draw their whole deck. Those games where they actually have to play, Vayu is definitely favored. We have Hero here. This deck tops everything but can't win anything. One of the reasons why I think that is because the best card of the deck is, well, there's two cards that are probably really good in the deck. Miracle Fusion, obviously, but this card, and we've talked about this before, requires setup. It's inconsistent on its own, and which is why Diva Hero is trying to fix that whole problem with like Gold Sarks and cards that search to try to piece together the cards needed for Miracle Fusion. But aside from Miracle Fusion, Gemini Spark is probably the best card in this deck. And or Hero Blast, but Spark is probably better. The problem is when you have Alias and a Spark and you're attacking, the goal is you want to attack with Alias, you want them to waste a D-Prison on it, and then you chain Spark. But when you're attacking face-down monsters and you hit Rykos, you can't activate Spark and damage step. So that's one reason why kind of Vayu and or Ryko makes Gemini Spark useless a lot of the time, or they have to play it preemptively, which is not good, because if you're just summoning Alias and they don't activate Bottomless there and you're just sparking a face down monster, you could also be hitting Necro Gardener, you could be hitting Plagues, you could be hitting Vayus. So it really creates an issue as the Hero Beat player when you're playing against Ryko decks specifically, when you're going to use the Sparks. Also, Hero Blast, it doesn't hit a whole lot in the deck. Sure, it hits the Armageddon Knights, but we don't really care about that. The second you summon Armageddon Knight, you've already used what you needed to do with it. And it doesn't kill any of the 2,300, the 2,500 monsters. Also, these monsters, last time I checked, 2,300 is bigger than 19. So that creates a bit of a problem here with this deck. And really, the best way to out some of these bigger monsters is with Miracle Fusion. And again, this deck plays Royal Oppression. A lot of the time, they're main deck in Royal Oppression. I'm not sure whose list this is, but looks like there's no Royal Oppression in this deck, but they often main deck one. So Hero Beat, I feel, is it's pretty consistent in terms of finding Stratos and kind of generating that early pressure with Stratos and a +1. And then kind of mid-game, it feels like it can fall off a little bit because of the fact that you need to piece together these Miracle Fusions. And sometimes that just doesn't happen. And I do think that this version is probably the best, maybe with a skill drain, just because this card's broken. And it's a floodgate, essentially. Also, Hero Beat seems to have issues in Top Cut because of the fact that Super Poly exists. This card is very strong against it. Hero Frogs is able to side deck it. Mirror Matches are able to side deck it. So that's a problem. Also, if you look at sideboard here, triple pulling the rug. So you're almost never going to get a Stratos off going second and or Diva just because this card is so strong. So again, I just don't see a weakness to this to Vayu, whereas we're pointing out some other flaws with some of the other decks and some weaknesses already. And we really, again, I might be missing something, but I just don't see it here. Let's look at the next deck here. This is Frogs. So Hero Frogs for a very long time, and if you watch Snack's video again, check out the Crow's Nest. Frogs had a very big surge, and there was a period of time where I truly felt Frogs, and it was pretty evident that Frogs was S tier, one of the top 2 or 3 decks of the format. I think since people have learned how to play against this deck, they've learned to side against this deck, and they have dedicated, most players have dedicated a large portion of the sideboard to stopping this deck. Because going game 1, this is the strongest game 1 deck aside from maybe Dragon Turbo, in my opinion. If you go first with this deck and you're playing game 1, you often just win game 1. So I think a lot of what was happening was that this deck would win game 1, and then you're kind of just hoping game 2 or 3 that you're able to win a game, one of those 2 games, just being either a better player or side decking appropriately or seeing cards at the right time. The problem is it's hard to do that consistently throughout a whole tournament. So this deck has won quite a few tournaments because it's still broken. Obviously, going first and just the combos it makes, it's completely unfair. But as you can see here, game 2. So I think game 1 probably Frogs is favored, but game 2 here, deck devies come in. This card's unbearable. Sometimes you can just hit like 5, 6, 7 Frogs. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes they have Monarchs in their hand and or Melissa's Edge or Stratos or whatever, and you don't hit anything. Vanity's Fiend is also another card that can just downright beat you sometimes. Crows can go in. They're not the best against that deck, but they can go in. Pulling the rugs. You got triple pulling the rug. I'm not sure if you'd side all 3 of them in because a lot of the Frog players are pretty smart and they take out some of the Monarchs and they put in Vanity's Fiend, so it's kind of like the mind game, how many Vanity Fiends going in, how many pulling the rugs. Also, Oppression is not bad against the Frog deck. It's something that else you can put in and maybe take some of the cards that are less potent against the deck. So again, this deck has multiple side deck options versus Frogs, whereas what is Frogs putting against Vayu? Maybe Torrential, maybe Mirror Force, but again, most of the time that you're Torrentialing or Mirror Forcing, it's against stuff that's in the graveyard, which they're just pluses essentially. Deep Prisons can go in. This build here actually side decks heavy amount of traps, which is probably the way the deck needs to go game 2 and 3. But again, one Crow can go in. But none of these cards directly stop a whole deck. So again, I do think Frogs is very strong, and it's obvious by the amount of tops it has. Frog has 26 tops, has 3 wins. And you can see the top decks here, just the top 4 decks anyway, just based on tops. So it's still very strong. I just think that there's too many side deck cards, and you can just look at a sideboard here, and it's very clear that 5, 6, 7, 8 cards maybe can just stop Frogs. Whereas you just don't really have that number. You're just putting in generic traps and hoping to play a more, fair game, more or less, as a Frog player. And where this deck, you really want to just be blowing out +1s every turn with Monarchs and Soul Exchanges with Substitutes and whatnot. So that's kind of my 2 cents with that one. And then we have Blackwing. So I'm not too familiar with the Blackwing versus Vayu matchup. I'm not sure what deck is even favored. Blackwing tops a lot of events, and this deck is a lot like Vayu, where it's just completely unfair, and there's really no counter to it. It side decks a lot of similar cards. You can have the deck Devastation Virus. You have triple pulling the rug here, and main decks an Oppression, sides an Oppression. This deck did choose to side double Nobleman, which is to try to hit the Vayu player, and Crows, which used to be pretty decent against the Vayu deck, but the problem is a lot of them are main decking Return now. So it's a way to kind of counteract the Crows. So the deck has been evolving some as well. I don't know what deck is actually favored in the matchup. I feel like it's probably more of a coin flip. But Blackwing is another one of those decks that are just completely unfair. Look how many times they just top everything. They're obviously highly represented, but they win a lot of events as well. If you have a choice at this point to play a deck and you just want to disregard the rest of the metagame, it's probably Blackwing or Vayu. But again, if you're playing value, what are you side decking in versus Blackwing? The only cards that you can really use are Dust Tornadoes, which is kind of crazy that a 1-for-1 trap is the main answer to a deck, but that's what we have. Royal Oppression is not very good against the Blackwing deck, which is maybe why they elected to side deck it here. But there's really not much you can put in. You kind of have to play the grind game and really know the matchup here. But these two decks are very resilient. I just don't know which one has an advantage over the other, but it's clear why these two decks just seem to dominate everything is because, again, they have very limited weakness. I don't see, especially with Blackwing, I can't tell you what really stops them. Maybe a timed Starlight Road, but players are very smart. They even side deck out some of the Icarus attack. They know Starlight Roads are going in. You're playing against some of the better players. That's not gonna happen. And then you have Dust Tornado. So there's really not an answer for either of these two decks. I think that they're both. This deck is obviously an S tier deck, and Vayu is obviously an S tier deck. At this point in time, if I had to make a tier list right now, I would say Vayu and Blackwing are probably S tier, maybe alone. I don't know. I'd have to really think about it. But again, this is probably the only deck that can go toe-to-toe with Vayu just because it also doesn't have a direct answer. And it's very prevalent, obviously. So you're going to be experiencing a lot of mirror matches and or the Vayu Blackwing matchup will happen a lot throughout a tournament. So that's that deck. And then we have Zombies. So Zombies, how did they fare this year? Zombies, 12 tops, and 2 wins. So one of the wins was just very recent, and then I think the other one was actually Soul from like early 2023. Zombies for a while kind of just died out. Obviously, for like last year, I think they won like 3 tournaments. They were topping a lot of events. I think I topped 5 events myself last year. In 2022. So this deck has obviously lost some steam here, and it's pretty obvious why. This is the newer updated version. I think someone recently just topped with it, and it's playing trap stuns to try to answer the Royal Oppressions, because Royal Oppression just completely destroys the deck, obviously. And it's even main decking Compulses, which is really good. I think this card's going to see a lot of more play in the main board just because this is one of the answers to Vayu. It's one of the best answers to Vayu just because you can get rid of the whole Synchro Monster and not even put it back in the graveyard. But this deck here, I don't think this is going to last very long. It's a lot of people are starting to see some of the flaws with the deck. I notice a lot of posting on Discords and whatnot. It's fun. I think that there needs to be some more work on this deck, but it's pretty clear why this deck does not beat Blackwings often enough or Vayu. I think that you can do some cool stuff with this deck, but you need to be able to stop the oppression, and Trap Stun is an answer to it. But you have to have the Trap Stun at the right time, and that doesn't always happen. So looking back at some of these decks here, it's pretty clear why, aside from Hero Beat, I'm just not sure, and Diva Hero, I'm not sure why this deck is able to top so many events but just not win. Maybe somebody will be able to point it out, but I just don't think it has enough going for it. It doesn't generate advantage very easily aside from like very good Hero Blast and Sparks, and the Raikou decks are able to stop that. And Miracle Fusion, again, is not the most consistent combo in any of the decks, so maybe it's just bad luck in Top Cut. I know True Hero got second place in one tournament, so that's like on any given day that deck could have just won that event right then and there. So, but again, I do think this is S tier deck. This deck is, in my opinion, right now, it's the best deck of the format. It's going to be heavily played in 2024. I'm not sure what the answer is going to be and how do you stop it. I think maybe people are going to be side decking more Noblemen, but again, that's kind of a flawed concept. And maybe people will stop main decking Dust Tornadoes, but then it becomes this whole issue where you main deck Dust Tornadoes and then you play against a Frog deck, and the Dust Tornadoes are pretty dead. And so I'm not sure what the answer is going to be. And today we're not going to figure that out. But I will be making a tier list soon. I'm going to sit down and really think about what I think is going to be prevalent in 2024. Because for the most part, I made a tier list at the beginning of 2023. And Hero Frogs and Blackwing were really dominating. And I felt like that was a pretty accurate list at the time. And of course, this changes months into the format, and the format does not look like it did in the beginning of 2023. So if you guys would comment what you feel or some of the reasons why Vayu just wins so many events and why Hero Beat can't seem to win any, I'm interested to hear. And War League will be starting in early 2024. We're going to really sit down and get that figured out over the next few weeks after the holidays. BCSs should be starting up in January again after the holidays. So if you'd like to join in any of that, join the Beast Mode Discord server. And with that being said, I'll see you all on the next one.